Okay, good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. Thanks for your patience. And thanks also for bearing with us with the change of location. I know some of you probably went all the way to Donnell Hall and trekked east. So thanks for joining us here in our new digs. I'd like to welcome you to the 29th Annual Presidency Panel. I'm Ramu Nagapan. I'm the Director of the Humanities and Education Department over at UC Berkeley Extension. We are co-presenters of this regular event with the Institute of Governmental Studies, and we are proud to have been part of this event for so long. It's an incredible review of the political climate, and as usual this year we have a stellar panel, and you'll be hearing from them shortly. With all the tumult in American politics over the last year, I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of interesting fireworks tonight. One quick plug for Extension. Out in front, you probably saw our catalogs and some brochures and other information. Those of you who are familiar with Extension know that we've been serving the community for over a century. We have a new summer catalog out with a whole slew of new courses. I encourage you to peruse that. Also on the back of today's program, there are a list of courses that you might find interesting that are related in some ways to tonight's event. So, before we begin, one other bit of housekeeping. I'd like to remind you to silence your mobile devices so we don't get interrupted. And then I'd like to say a few words of introduction for our moderator tonight, Ethan Rarick. Ethan is the director of the Center on Politics and of Publications at the Institute of Governmental Studies. He's a journalist who's covered California and Oregon for a long time. He's written for the Associated Press, the United Press International, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chronicle here. His most recent book is called Desperate Passage, The Donner Party's Perilous Journey West. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ethan.
Ramu, thank you very much, and let me echo Ramu in saying thank you for making it here to a new room halfway across campus. So congratulations, you are the hardy few who managed the trek here. I'm going to be very quick with introductions of the panel, and then we're just going to jump in. I know we're a little bit late in starting. To my far left is Peter Hart. Peter is one of the leading public opinion pollsters and public opinion analysts in the United States. Since 1971, he's been chairman of Peter D. Hart Research Associates. Beginning in 1989, he teamed with the late Robert Teeter, and now he teams with Bill McInturf to conduct the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll. He's conducted political polling for more than 40 U.S. senators and 30 governors, including Hubert Humphrey, Lloyd Bentsen, and Jay Rockefeller, among many others. He's also done public opinion work for clients such as the Smithsonian Institution, the Kennedy Center, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The National Journal named Peter to its list of 150 national leaders who shaped federal government policy and called him, quote, probably the foremost Washington pollster for the Democratic Party and its centrist candidates, and identified him as someone who plays a key role in identifying and shaping national trends and political messages. He appears frequently on many television programs, including Meet the Press, The Today Show, and others. He's taught public opinion and public policy at Duke, at the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania, and currently teaches here at UC Berkeley. And perhaps most important of all, he's a member of the National Advisory Council for the Institute of Governmental Studies. To my immediate left is Mark Halperin. Mark is editor-at-large and senior political analyst for Time. He covers elections, politics, and government for both the magazine and Time.com. He is the creator and author of The Page, a daily tip sheet that appears on Time.com and that is an invaluable tool for insiders to keep track of what's going on in politics. Prior to joining Time, Mark worked for 20 years, nearly 20 years at ABC News, where he covered 5 presidential elections and served as political director from November 1997 to April 2007. In that role, he was responsible for political reporting and planning for the network's television, radio, and internet political coverage. He's authored or co-authored 3 books, including The Undecided Voter's Guide to the Next President, which is actually the current president, since that book appeared in 2007, The Way to Win, Taking the White House in 2008, and most recently, a #1 New York Times bestseller, Game Change, Obama and the Clintons, Palin and McCain, and the Race of a Lifetime. And I hope that all of you saw that book is for sale outside, and if you're interested, it will still be for sale after this program is over, and Mark will stay around and autograph copies. To my immediate right is Stephen Hayward. Stephen is the F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow in Law and Economics at the American Enterprise Institute and Senior Fellow at the Pacific Research Institute. He holds a PhD in American Studies from Claremont Graduate School and teaches constitutional theory at Georgetown University. He writes frequently on a wide range of current topics, including environmentalism, law, economics, and public policy. His writing has appeared in many, many publications, including National Review, Reason, The Weekly Standard, and many others. He is the author of the annual Index of Leading Environmental Indicators, which always traditionally has been released on Earth Day, although Peter just told me, or Stephen just told me at lunch that he's revising the schedule for the annual index. He's written biographies of Winston Churchill and Jimmy Carter, and is the author of a 2-volume narrative history of Ronald Reagan and his effect on American political life. It is entitled The Age of Reagan. The first volume is The Fall of the Old Liberal Order, 1964 to 1980. The second volume, The Conservative Counter-Revolution, 1980 to 1989. That book was also supposed to be for sale outside. Unfortunately, there's another book called The Age of Reagan, and the bookstore ordered the wrong Age of Reagan. So, I already apologized over dinner. If any of you want to buy Stephen's book, go online and buy it at Amazon, I guess. We'll have to have him come back and he can sign all of them. And to my far right is Mark Bareback. Mark has been a newspaper reporter for more than 30 years, covering campaigns and elections in 48 of the 50 states. We'll have to take up a collection to get you the last 2. I didn't know you'd missed 2, but do you know what they are?
Of course, Wyoming and Rhode Island.
Oh, well. He has covered 9 presidential elections. He started his career as a legal affairs reporter for News West News Service in San Diego, later worked for United Press International in San Diego, Phoenix, and Los Angeles, later moved to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1984, then the Washington Bureau of Copley News Service, and joined the Los Angeles Times in 1997, where he now covers both national and state politics. During his career, Mark has covered both the White House and Capitol Hill and written a weekly Inside Washington column. Since joining the Times, he's covered 4 presidential elections, 4 California gubernatorial races, the 2003 gubernatorial recall, and Governor Schwarzenegger's 2005 special election. And I might say, as a friend of Mark's and somebody who emails with him, he travels around the country talking about politics as much as anybody I know. I'm always getting emails from him in San Antonio or wherever, but not Wyoming and Rhode Island, apparently.
Not yet.
So we have a terrific panel tonight, and we want to jump right in. I suppose it's impossible to talk about the president's last year without talking about health care, the signature achievement of the last year, and we'll see if it proves to be the signature achievement of his presidency. Mark, let me begin by asking you, and as always, I want the other panelists jump right in, but let me begin by asking you, it wasn't very long ago that most people assumed the health care measure was largely dead and Obama would have to settle for a half a loaf or a quarter or an eighth of a loaf, maybe. And instead, he turned that around and got most of what he wanted in a bill that, as we all know, he signed. So take us through briefly, if you can, A, how did that happen? And B, what does the health care success tell us about Obama's leadership style, about his presidential style?
Well, I never thought it was going to be dead. I usually am wrong about my predictions. I said on the day before Hillary Clinton went to Chicago to interview, as it turned out to be Secretary of State, that in response to a question at an event like this, that there was no possible way Hillary Clinton would join the Obama administration or be asked to. So my record of predictions is not that great. In this case, I never thought it was dead. And I think the thing that saved it and kept it on track was, counterintuitively, Scott Brown winning the race in Massachusetts. If Democrats had had 60 votes in the Senate, they would have had to repass the bill and do a conference committee and repass the bill in both the House and the Senate. And I don't think it would have been easy to find something that Joe Lieberman, Evan Bayh, and Henry Waxman and Maxine Waters all would have been for. I think that would have been very tough. Scott Brown's victory meant that they had to do, from that day it was clear, they had to do what they ended up doing, which is they had to basically force the House Democrats to pass the Senate bill and then do a reconciliation bill to do some changes in it. The White House was criticized throughout last year for its legislative strategy. People thought they were too deferential to Congress. I thought their legislative strategy was perfect. They were deferential in public, but behind the scenes they were extraordinarily involved every step of the way, the White House Chief of Staff in particular and the legislative affairs staff, in getting a bill that would work. Their strategy all along was to get a bill more like the Senate bill. They didn't want to publicly cross House liberals, but they knew the Senate would pass a more conservative bill, more moderate bill, and they could use the leverage of saying, we're going to move on from health care, we can move on having failed as a party, we can move on having succeeded, Scott Brown gave them even more leverage because the House had to pass the Senate bill, not use the leverage of the Senate in a conference committee to pass something. And I thought that hiccup helped them, but it saw the culmination of what they were planning all along. The greatest, most admirable thing about this president, and it applies in the case of healthcare to Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, is they were willing to fight for something they believed in, even though the polls suggested it was unpopular. I think whether you agree with the bill or not, if you think it's too liberal or too conservative, it's extraordinarily admirable for anyone in public life to say publicly and privately, this thing could hurt us electorally, this thing is not currently popular, we believe in it, we're going to do it. And they did. And I think that's admirable, and I think they were right, and this is something I was wrong about. I think this will be a greater electoral victory and a greater benefit for them in the midterm elections and beyond than it seemed at the time of passage, because people are now focusing on the more positive things. And the bill is not identical to what he campaigned on, but it's remarkably similar. And again, that's extraordinarily admirable. We should all want, whether we agree with them or not, presidents to come into office, try to pass the things they campaigned on, particularly someone like Obama, who had a big mandate electorally, and work hard to do it, and even if it seems unpopular, and that's what he did. And I think you're already seeing the effects at home and abroad. He's gone in 2 weeks from Jimmy Carter to FDR and Rambo combined, and I think you're going to see political strength continuing on.
Can I append something to what you said? President Obama was fortuitous too. In November of last year, WellPoint, Anthem, submitted a request to the insurance commissioner in Sacramento for a rate increase. They had no idea it was going to be a big deal. No one at Anthem or the state insurance commissioner's office thought it was going to be a big deal. These things always pass. They always go through. Basically, the insurance commissioner has things they go through, and if everything checks out, then fine. So these notices started going out to mailboxes across California at the end of February. 39%, as high as 25% was the average. Huge rate increase. Story breaks. The White House seizes on it. 2 days after the story's published, the president is on the Super Bowl talking about this incredible rate hike. And appending to what Mark said, the thing with this Anthem thing, I mean, everyone's nodding their head. Everyone by now has heard about it. What that gave the administration was a talking point, and more than that, it gave them an opportunity to frame healthcare in a way they hadn't been able to before. They were able to say to folks that if we do nothing, it's going to be a problem. We're going to see these kinds of rate increases going on. There was always the argument, start over, don't do anything. This was an argument to do something, and it also broadened the case because it's really hard to make the case to cover the uninsured. I mean, as altruistic as we all are, a lot of people are basically, hey, I have insurance, so things are fine. This said to people who have insurance, who happen to be a broad part, as people can tell you, of the people who actually show up and vote and politically matter a great deal. This was impacting them. This wasn't just raising your taxes to cover someone down the street. This was your rates going up. So that was a huge, huge gift following the Scott Brown situation.
But how much credit does Obama personally deserve? I mean, you mentioned Pelosi and Reid being willing to fight for something that was unpopular. How much credit should accrue to the president personally? And what was his role, if any, in sort of turning around the misfortune? I guess you could say his role was in, I don't know if he helped Scott Brown. I don't know if Scott Brown was elected because of furor over Obama. But what was his role in sort of pushing this bill to final passage, if any?
Oh, gigantic. I mean, he publicly gave that speech to the House Democrats. I think that the deal was done by then, but that was extraordinarily important for them. He gave them public relations cover, and behind the scenes in the room, he was extraordinarily influential in convincing members of Congress, particularly the wavering House Democrats, who he said correctly, my presidency's on the line. If we pass this, we can go forward having succeeded on our big promise, or we can go forward having failed. And that was extraordinarily persuasive. I will say, just quickly, I think not doing it in a bipartisan way was while he fulfilled the campaign promise by passing health care, he completely abrogated responsibility to fulfill the promise he said to do things like this in a bipartisan way. And I think that was extraordinarily unwise, and will come back to haunt him later in his presidency.
Well, but remember the title of his second autobiography, The Audacity of Hope. And I've been sort of fixed on his choice of audacity. Audacity is one of those ambiguous virtues. It means brave, courageous, but it can also mean reckless and presumptuous and foolhardy. So I think the jury is out about this. I actually think, I deeply admire the determination to do this. I didn't think they would pass health care. I also thought, to step back, half a step for a moment, I didn't think that the first year of Obama's administration, he was doing a repeat of Jimmy Carter. I think it started changing in December. Actually, I think the Nobel Prize speech is where I date a change in him. But then, the moment to me that was most impressive was, you remember he went to the House Republican caucus retreat, where he was masterful. I mean, he clobbered him, he wiped the floor with him, partly because House Republicans don't know how to ask a question sensibly. And then he had that bipartisan meeting with the leaders of both parties on health care. That didn't go quite as smoothly, but at the end of that, remember he said, pretty close to the exact words, he said, well, at some point, everybody, we have to govern. And we're going to govern, and that's what elections are for. That was really impressive to me, because the typical politician who wants to be, we're sort of used to being insincerely flattered by these folks. He didn't retreat to the platitudes about, let's start over and try and find what's in common and all the rest of that. He laid it all out there. Now, there is a reason, and it speaks to your last point, Mark, there is a reason why most big changes in policy happen on a bipartisan basis. Social Security got a lot of Republican votes. The Civil Rights Act got a lot of Republican votes. So did Medicare, voting rights, a lot of the big ones. Obama decided, I think a long time ago, part of his commitment and serious commitment to the idea of being an audacious president is that if I can't actually govern the way Bill Clinton did in that sort of third way sort of sense, then I'm going to govern to win arguments and win them decisively. So he's willing to take a big risk. So I say that's a deeply admirable trait, I think, in a president. I think this is extremely risky because now, if Social Security or Medicare had gone wrong, and Medicare kind of has gone wrong, both parties are part of it. But the problem now, just to make one sentence about health care, is that the Democratic Party now owns it, and in the fullness of time, the government is going to begin to have to do what insurance companies do now, which is make tough decisions on slowing care, saying no to expensive cancer treatments. But we don't even really know how this thing's going to work yet, because in scores of places in that very long bill, it delegates to administrative agencies writing the rules and regulations of how it's actually going to work. That's going to take 2 or 3 years. So it's possible, other people have said this, it's possible that the health care reform could work out to be Obama's domestic policy equivalent of the Iraq War. Something initially possibly popular, but could end up being unpopular. I think it's too unpredictable to say, but I think that, I actually think Peter, he hasn't spoken yet, I think the really question going forward, and maybe we shouldn't play election forecast, is what's the over and under line for this election? I think if Republicans have a big number, it's going to be very tough on Obama. If it's a small number, then I think he can claim vindication for his strategy of audaciousness.
Okay, let me.
Before we get to over and under, though, can you also, or after you, can we also? What's the reaction so far in the polling to the health care? Is the health care bill going to help or hurt Obama and Democrats?
I first have to start out and reveal something that Mark has told you as a secret. We actually had the Massachusetts Senate seat locked up, and we had to go to Martha Coakley and say to her, you've got to give it away in order to help us for health care.
The decision to insult the Red Sox was brilliant.
That's right. So we didn't want to let everybody in, but since Mark told you the secret, we had to do that. In any respect, let me turn to the political consequences. And I think the best way to look at the political consequences is to understand the issue of enthusiasm towards the 2010 election. In our NBC Wall Street Journal poll, we find 67% of Republicans have a great deal of interest in going to the polls. 46% of the Democrats. That's a 21-point differential, higher than we have ever seen. And to understand how that translates, while with all voters, the Democrats have a 45-42 advantage, 3 points. When you take those most likely to vote, the Republicans have a 13-point advantage. And the importance of that is short term. And that is, finally, the Democrats have an accomplishment. Finally, there's a reason for Democrats to rally. So leaving aside all the very good points that Mark's made, the additional element in all of this is it was the only way Democrats could go in order to be able to get back in the ballgame for 2010. And we'll get to your question, Stephen, as we move along where the over and under is.
Can I usurp your moderator role and ask you a question, Peter? How long is it going to take for opinion to settle out? I mean, really settle out?
Good question, Mark. And from my point of view, I think this is one of these areas where you can't do an instant analysis. You can't come in right after an event and say, how did it measure out? How's it shake out? I think you've got to wait 3 to 4, maybe 6 weeks to really get how it settles, because it was such a white-hot issue that at this stage, I think the intensity levels are much higher than they will be 6 weeks from now. They will get ginned back up in the fall, but not to that level. And my sense is you're going to have to wait several weeks. Right now, what we see is the division of opinion is about where it was prior to passage.
Can I go back to your point about bipartisan? Well, both you and Mark made the point that this was not done in a bipartisan way. And a lot of people have talked about that and have talked about Social Security, Medicare passing in a bipartisan way. But isn't it, and I'll ask you this first and then let everybody else jump in, isn't it much harder to do things in a bipartisan way now, because the parties used to be less ideologically pure? There were liberal Northeastern Republicans, there were Southern conservative Democrats. How on earth would you do anything in a bipartisan way now, given the ideological division of the parties?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think political scientists haven't grappled with enough, as a self-sorting of the parties. It would be interesting to do a thought experiment to rerun some of those old battles like Civil Rights Act or Medicare. But look, I mean, you had bipartisan cooperation in the 90s on welfare reform, on achieving a balanced budget. It was a more complicated and messy matter. Look, I mean, on the healthcare business, you had a solid core of the Democrats who really wanted the public option. And I think there are no Republicans who are going to go along with that. And as long as that sort of, I think, divided the debate early on and made it very much harder to come back together. The other thing is that I think we have reached a point, I mean, look, even Social Security is small potatoes compared to the health care bill in terms of its magnitude. And I think it's very hard for government these days to do something this large without it being this contentious. So I don't know, that's a serious problem to think about. I mean, this goes beyond just this particular issue, but we do have this problem now. Plus, we add to the 24/7 news cycle, which now we sort of amplify, all the arguments, and the volume gets turned way up, and that sort of reverberates in Washington, and it makes it hard for people. I just do thought experiments sometimes. What would Watergate have been like with cable news and the internet? And so I think about, again, I'm a Reagan guy. Reagan and Tip O'Neill would fight really hard and call each other names in their meetings, and then at the end of the day, they'd share a drink together. That's not happening anymore because the camps are too dug in, and I think everyone regrets that, and no one has a good answer for it.
And we talked about this at lunch a little bit, but you actually think there could have been bipartisan agreement on much of the health care bill?
Well, step back and say, and look at what candidate Obama said. Candidate Obama said this would be a fundamental goal of his, to solve the big national challenges in a bipartisan way, and that he was uniquely qualified as compared to Hillary Clinton and John McCain to do these things. There was skepticism on the part of Senator Clinton, then Senator Clinton, saying Obama doesn't have the experience to do this. She worked in the Senate in as bipartisan a way as any senator during her time there, and Barack Obama faced a choice early in his presidency before health care, and I think it was too late because of the choice he made to do it on health care, because of the choice he made on the stimulus bill. He chose on the stimulus bill to largely do it in a way that was not palatable to Republicans. It would have been hard. My liberal friends tell me all the time, Republicans don't want to work with the president. The city is too divided. The culture is too divided. There's too many raw feelings. All true, but all things known to Barack Obama when he promised as president to try to solve these problems in a bipartisan way. To do that, he would have had to work on a model like welfare reform under Bill Clinton, where you put in the room the Republican whip and the Democratic whip, and we say, we're getting to 270 votes. Here's how many the Democrats are going to provide. Here's how many the Republicans are going to provide. And you say to liberals in the Democratic Party and conservatives in the Republican Party, goodbye, we're not getting your votes. On substance, it's there. Barack Obama and Senator Gregg of New Hampshire on health care could go in a room and write a bill together in 2 hours that wouldn't give Barack Obama everything he wanted, wouldn't give him as much as he got in this bill, in this law, but would give him enough to draw that he would think would be good and that would draw in Republicans. He didn't do it on stimulus. It was too late to do on health care, and he has failed in that promise, just as Bill Clinton failed and George Bush failed. And I think the cake is now baked for the rest of this term at least, barring some intervening event like a Martian invasion that unites the country, that he successfully repels. He's not going to find a way to work with Republicans, and that is, again, a failure of something he promised, not for fun, not because it's fun to work in a bipartisan way, but because this health care bill, as it is implemented, is going to be challenged violently, not with physical violence, but rhetorical violence, not just by conservative members of Congress, but across the country. I was in New Orleans at a Republican event over the weekend that Mark was at also. I was in Searchlight, Nevada, listening to a Tea Party event. Their attitude towards this man and this law is not one that is going to foster national unity to say, now we're joining the other countries that have universal health care, let's do it together.
Let me ask you something, this is a discussion, so for discussion's sake, and you all weren't privy, we were talking earlier about stimulus, and I had asked you how he could have gotten Republicans to go along, and you said, a different ratio of tax cuts to spending. My understanding, I'm not an expert, although I sometimes play one in the newspaper, but my understanding that at the time they were drafting this thing, they were saying the best kind of spending to get the economy going was spending and not tax cuts. So couldn't you make the argument that what he did was what, it didn't make Republicans happy, but it was what economists were saying needed to be done to get us out of this economic ditch?
At the time they made the decision to reject to reject changing the bill to get Republican votes, they had a calculation. The White House thought the Republican Party was extraordinarily weak, and it was, and that they could either force Republicans to vote for a stimulus bill, because who's going to vote against a stimulus bill at a time of economic crisis, or have them vote no and beat them in the next election over. They made that choice very clearly. They chose not to compromise. It's more symbolic and personal than it is substantive, but they had to change the culture. And you don't change the culture by saying to Republicans, Nancy Pelosi and Charlie Rangel and other liberals are going to write the bill, and you can join us if you want. They chose to do that, and again, they locked in a culture that the president said he'd change rather than changing it.
Okay, I don't disagree with you in terms of the stimulus bill. Certainly on the health care bill, they tried to find middle ways. I mean, whether it was Baucus effort or whether it was Ron Wyden, they did have things that they could go with. It seems to me that the Republicans were pretty locked in place, that they were one way or another going to vote 100%. I mean, I have no doubt in my mind that if Arlen Specter had stayed a Republican, he would have voted no.
But I agree with you that they wasted time trying to get the Republicans. They couldn't. But the reason they couldn't was because in the first major thing the president did, he chose to do it the Bush way. He chose to say, I'm going to get 50.1 of my party, and we're not going to get Republican votes. And the Republicans then were so weak on health care, the only thing they had was to play to the Fox News wing of the party and oppose health care. And then he missed that chance. But I agree with you. They couldn't get it on health care, but because they made a mistake on stimulus.
Wait a minute. I want to ask Peter a little more broadly, though, because we're talking about bipartisanship and the culture in Washington and so forth. Peter, you've been in Washington for longer than anybody else here. You've been there a long time.
Congratulations.
I mean,
Second prize is 2 weeks in Philadelphia.
yeah, I'll tell you, the Cleveland election was the one that I really enjoyed working on. But yes.
The last great Democrat.
So is the culture worse than it has been?
Of course it is. And it goes directly about what we've all talked about, and Mark, you talked about, and that is 24/7 and how that affects everything. Because now what we have is no longer unity voices that work in the country, but in place of unity voices, where we are is everybody goes to their own cheerleading section. So they rush over to Fox News if they're on the right, they rush over to MS, or they rush over to CNN, et cetera. Everybody is looking for their own voice. And within Washington, and Mark knows this as well, and that is, there is no sort of personal relationships. I mean, that the old days when you used to get together, and whether it was lawmakers or staff, where they had that personal relationships, they don't exist. I mean, I'm an exception, as you say, old timer. I've got a lot of friends on the other side, only because I started in a different era. You can't find it today.
And to underscore something that the smart Mark said, Peter referred to a bill Ron Wyden, senator from Oregon, had on health care. His partner in that legislation was the senator from Utah, Bob Bennett, who very likely may end up losing he might not even make the ballot in Utah. They have a caucus next month, and right now the people I've talked to said he could very well finish third. Here's a guy who is I mean, grandson of a president of the Mormon Church. His father held the seat for 60 years. I mean, he is an institution in Utah, and one of the things they're pointing out is that he had the temerity to partner up with a Democrat on a bipartisan health care bill.
Yeah. Look, in an odd way, the big majorities in Congress were an obstacle to bipartisanship. And again, I think the contrast is with the Reagan experience. Reagan had a smashing victory, but not a majority in the House. So he had to appeal to Democrats if he was going to get his program through, and that meant appealing to the American public and making arguments about it, and taking ownership of his own plan. I mean, one really striking contrast, the stimulus bill was really, he let Congress write it. It became Congress's stimulus bill, even if behind the scenes they were involved in some details. It lacked the public argument of it. Well, there was a real shocking moment, I thought, in the first week that was not to Obama's advantage. It was when the reporter asked Speaker Pelosi, did Republicans have any input in the bill? And she said, well, we won the election, so we wrote the bill. That was a bad moment, I thought, because I think Obama in those meetings with Republicans could have said behind closed doors, give me your 10 best ideas and I'll put them in a stimulus bill. We're spending $800 billion anyway, what's a few more? By the way, if you'd put in, one of the things missing from the stimulus bill was anything from the Defense Department. If you want to stimulate the economy, speed up procurement for all the stuff we're breaking in Iraq and Afghanistan. You got to replace that anyway, and that puts people to work right away. And they didn't want to do that. But if you put that in the stimulus bill, I think you'd have gotten 10 votes at least out of the Republicans in the House. So I think that was a mistake and a lost opportunity where they didn't follow the Reagan model of deliberately appealing to the other party because it's necessary. Because it wasn't necessary, oddly, they thought we didn't have to, for the reasons Mark mentioned. The Republicans looked weak and believed, they still are weak, by the way. What's the Republican argument right now? Sorry to digress. Is you vote for us? We really mean it this time?
Not Obama.
Yeah, not very persuasive.
We're not Obama, right?
Yeah, and that may work, but it's not enough.
And as Mark mentioned, we were in New Orleans, and you saw unfolding there the debate. You literally had Newt Gingrich giving a speech on his Thursday night, saying, we need to be the party of yes. And start every sentence, every conversation you had, anytime you go before a microphone, you should begin by saying, here's what we're for. We're for jobs, we're for lower taxes, et cetera, et cetera. We need to be the party of yes. And then the next day, Sarah Palin said, what's wrong with being the party of no? If you disagree with stuff. And then you had Bobby Jindal, who came down in the middle, who said, we need to be the party of yes, except on healthcare, we need the party of hell no. So, there's still that whole question.
By the way, for you Berkeley lefties out there, what I observed watching on TV, Newt Gingrich is losing weight.
Which explain that. You take as a measure that
he's going to run.
There you go. Let's go. We mentioned the 24/7 news cycle, and I know I should tell people in the audience that among the crowd is Peter Hart's class, and they have to write about how voters get information nowadays. So let's digress from the president just a little bit, and let me ask the two Marks about the changes in your profession and what it means in politics.
When we talk about Time and the LA Times, those were revered institutions around which so much it was central in terms of the dialogue. The fact of the matter is, it is no longer the central element.
Don't sugarcoat it. Call us irrelevant. That's fine.
So my question is, how does that change the politics, and how does it change the voter in terms of both how they get information and, more importantly, how the dialogue goes forward in terms of all of this?
You want to start?
I'll defer to the actual smart Mark.
Well, no. Listen, boy, I could talk about this one all night. Okay, so let's put the positive spin. There's a greater democratization of information, if you want to sound highfalutin about it, right? It's not just what Mark Halperin thinks or what I think or what Jeff Zeleny or Adam Negroni at the New York Times thinks, right? It's like anyone has a blog, anyone can put their stuff out there, and it's this great marketplace of ideas. I think what tends to be lost is the time that, I think a few things are lost. I think, experience and insight is lost. I think what we've traded a lot, I think what's traded very often is attitude for what I call institutional memory, knowing stuff, having some historical perspective. There's an immediacy, and yes, it's good to know exactly what's happening up to the moment, but I think what is lost is analysis and thought and perspective. So, like I said, and it's not just because I'm a dinosaur and I'm an old media, newspaper, dead tree kind of guy, but I do think that it's been, for the most part, I think it's been bad.
Do you agree?
Well, anyone in our business, like the two of us, who has the least bit of sense of survival instinct or sensitivity or thoughtfulness spends a lot of time thinking about these issues. So let me try to be as brief as I can, as Mark was. Our business is in crisis, and it has an effect on democracy. The most fundamental thing the two things that are fundamentally our responsibility as political reporters. One is to tell interesting stories about our time, but the more fundamental responsibility is to hold powerful interests accountable to the public interest. In the context of covering a government, a White House and Congress, or a campaign, it's to hold these candidates and these office holders accountable. If we are less well-funded, less experienced, stretched thinner because we have to file 8 times a day rather than once a day or once a week, we're just not going to be able to hold them as accountable as well. If we are 22-year-olds who have never been out of the United States or covered the State Department or Capitol Hill, and we're covering a presidential candidate, we're just not going to do the same kind of job. One of the biggest weaknesses that Barack Obama retains is, unlike Reagan and unlike Clinton, he has no overarching narrative about where he wants to take the country, how that connects to his biography, how that connects to his programs. And we, the collective press, allowed him to get elected without demanding that he flesh that out more. Presidential candidates tend to do only what they need to do to get elected and no more. To get elected, he simply had to first not be Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, then he had to not be George Bush and John McCain. And until he has that overarching narrative, until he has the ability to explain himself, he's not going to be the kind of transformative president he'd like to be, even with the passage of health care. And again, that's because the press corps did not hold him accountable for a variety of reasons, including that we are stretched way too thin, and that the old media, big institutions who can file Freedom of Information Act requests, who can draw on years and years of experience, simply don't have the resources or the influence that we used to have. That having been said, the old organizations are still the most influential in a presidential campaign. There's a reason why the networks get interviews. There's a reason why Mark and I get interviews. We still reach more people who vote than even Facebook for people in Peter's class.
Can I just have to say one thing real quick? I've been having this conversation for, like I said, I've been a reporter for 30 years. Since I've been having this thing. Two, you know what? People want to let readers and viewers off the hook, but you know what? I mean, give yourselves all a round of applause. You're terrific people. You're informed. You're here. You're interested in this sort of stuff. Most people tonight are sitting home watching American Idol or whatever. I mean, people always want to criticize the media, but you know what? I think some of the responsibility is with the consumer. And one of the great things about the internet is you can go online, and if you want to watch this thing tomorrow again, you can watch it. If you want to go online and read the state budget, it's there. I mean, the information is there. I think we're too quick to criticize the media. I think something should be said about the people who don't take advantage of all the stuff that is out there to inform themselves. And that's the bottom line. Make an informed decision. I don't care who you vote for, but make an informed choice.
I respond to both Marks and lay down a marker. I'm going to say that about Mark Halperin. I want to disagree with you a little bit, Mark, but Obama doesn't have an overarching vision for where he wants to take America. I don't traffic in that he's a socialist and want to make us Europe and all the rest of that. That's sort of frothy and overwrought. However, I do think, and I think you can deduce this from his writings if you read him carefully in his speeches, I think his ambition is to be the fourth great wave of liberal reform in the country, akin to progressivism, the New Deal, and the Great Society. And healthcare is just one part of all that. And I think he's gone about this very carefully and deliberately and has been cautious about his rhetoric for prudential political reasons. I think he understands that independent voters thought they were getting another Bill Clinton, another third way type. And he's probably willing to go that way if that worked, but again, with the healthcare thing, when it wasn't going to work, he's just going to go right ahead. And I think,
what are the coming elements of this conspiracy?
Well, I mean, higher tax rates. I mean, there was that wonderful moment in the debate when Charlie Gibson asked him, every time we cut capital gains taxes, the revenues go up, because that's a somewhat discretionary tax. And he says, I'm for higher rates anyway in the interest of fairness. Well, that's an old, sort of liberal value that Bill Clinton signed on to a cut in the capital gains tax rate, right? And we're going to have higher levels of spending. I mean, we're now going to go from roughly 22% of GDP up to 27, 28, going forward permanently. I mean, that's a large expansion of the government. And I think those are big changes. And
but if he's going to do the lefty thing and be the next LBJ, I mean, he didn't push for. I mean, you never heard the word single payer come up except on the far fringes. I mean, he didn't do.
Well, remember, he used to say before he was president, that's what he was for. And it would take a while to get there.
But and Mitt Romney will dispute it until the cows come home. I mean, a lot of this bill is a lot like the one that a Republican drafted in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, and there was some stuff that, I mean, this bill was more conservative than some of the stuff Richard Nixon was talking about.
This is a problem for Romney.
Well, yeah.
Your point, sorry if I can swivel, sorry.
Sure, go ahead. And then I
Are
want
you
to go back
agreeing
to
or
Obama.
disagreeing? If you're disagreeing, then I think we should move on. No.
Well, no, no, I'm going to disagree a little bit, or not disagree, pick a fight, but one of the problems with, the internet and media, it's information overload. To be a geeky political scientist for a moment, this will please Jack, political scientists have the idea of rational ignorance, which is people are busy. These are motivated people, publicly spirited people who are interested in these subjects. And like you said, most people are home watching Dancing with the Stars or one of these shows that I find completely unwatchable because I'm weird, right?
I'm with you on that.
Okay, well that marks us all out as pretty weird, right?
You're with him that he's weird, or you're with him
Actually, except when Tom DeLay is on, that was funny. I mean, that was, God, my mouth, I was hours getting my mouth off the floor. Anyway, but so here's the thing. The problem of rational ignorance is this, and this will sound perverse, I think, to most of you in this room, is that it actually makes sense for people to be ignorant about this broad range of public issues that require a lot of expertise. Peter, I think, finds us a challenge in polling people for their opinions about things. Because, if you're going to buy a car, big decision, you're going to lay out a lot of money. You're going to read the Consumer Reports things, you're going to read reviews, you're going to ask your friends. But a pollster calls you up and says, what do you think about health care? If you ask 4 or 5 questions, you may start getting contradictory opinions, right? This is why the art of the pollster is so hard, to try and figure out what people really think as opposed to what is just a tossed off opinion. And so, nowadays there's more and more things that we're worrying about, more things to keep us up awake at night in the world, and more problems to solve in this country. And, an awful lot of people, they just sort of, I think this is one, not the main reason, but one reason why voting has been on that long-term secular decline is people say, I'm not going to bother with all that.
Let me take us back to Obama, but let me also do one housekeeping measure first, which is that there were index cards passed out earlier for questions. Go ahead and write down your questions, and we're going to have people come along the edge of the aisle and collect those. So if you have a question, write it down. Preferably make it short. I can't read little tiny speeches. And pass them to the end of the aisle. Somebody will come around and collect them, and then they'll be brought up to me. But let me, you mentioned that Obama, in your view, wants to be this, what you call the fourth wave of American liberalism. So what I think Mark was trying to ask this, I'm not quite sure I heard the answer. What's next? If that's true, what's, other than higher tax rates, what does he do next? Now that he's done health care, where does he go from here?
Let me give it will sound like an odd answer, especially to Mark. I don't think it matters exactly. I mean, one of the reasons I think he chose that strategy that Mark correctly pointed to of delegating to Congress the details of a lot of these things while working behind the scenes. 2 things. One is the argument I make is the Democratic Party is a legislative party while the Republican Party is more of an executive party. So it's actually harder for a Democratic president to order Congress what to do. That's why Carter and Clinton got in such trouble with their own parties. That's a political science point. But the other one is I think he's thinking of a deeper and longer game. And the reason I sort of make that point is, again, in both the campaign but in his books, implicitly and in some places explicitly, his criticism of Bill Clinton is that Bill Clinton was this talented politician who conceded way too much to the right. He had this wonderful economy and all these political gifts, and he didn't press it hard enough. So I think Obama is, again, thinking like Roosevelt, wants to make a political realignment the way Roosevelt did. I think Obama envisioned his election as introducing a new wave of Democratic dominance. And that's why this next election is so crucial in seeing if that's, if that bears out or not. And so in that sense, I think you sort of take your opportunities in exactly the same way Roosevelt did. What do we say about the New Deal? Well, it was constant improvisation. Try one thing, try another. I don't think there's a deliberate plan or conspiracy. We do this, and this. I think he'll take the opportunities as they come because he's playing for a deeper, longer game.
What year is he coming for my guns?
But is it a real, look, if Roosevelt was over here, right, my left, and Reagan pulled it over there, is Obama trying to pull it back over there, or would he argue that he's just trying to bring it more over here?
I think he is trying to displace Reagan. You know what, his language about Reagan was interesting. Reagan was a change agent, words to that effect, and right for his time. Okay, interesting. This is a new time, calls for different things. Doesn't have to necessarily confront the argument directly. He's just going to go out and do it quietly and deliberately. Does that make sense? I don't.
But like again, I mean, I wonder. I mean, is this FDR LBJ reincarnate, or is he just trying to move, in his view, that things have gone too far to the right and that the market was too free, perhaps, and he's just bringing it, a little back more toward the center? And I'm not making that argument. I'm just Or what do you think? You wrote the book on the guy. What do you guys?
I like having Stephen on the panel, but what I would tell you is it's a little bit of a stretch. And to me, one of the things that's kind of fascinating is what the voters see as missing in the president. And I did a focus group last week in which we had a series of people who voted for Obama. And I asked the simple question, given all the presidents taking Kennedy forward, what quality do you think Obama is missing that he should take from another president? And the interesting quality that they chose really came from Nixon and LBJ. And what they said is, he's not a politician. They do not see him as having the skills of a politician. And so when Mark gives him great credit, and indeed he deserves behind the scenes the way in which he talked to people, clearly he did not control the process. And what the voters saw in Nancy Pelosi during this process is everything that they saw that's missing in Obama. So,
And they saw it as a bad thing that he was not a politician? That's interesting.
yeah,
See, that's
because essentially what they're saying is, different from Stephen, I don't think this guy has the political moxie to get things through, to be able to push, and they see him more as an orator, a visionary, somebody with a larger vision. The other thing that is fascinating here is the other quality that they saw missing in Obama, they said came from Reagan and Clinton. And what they said is, I don't see the human dimension, the ability to relate to the individual. Again, the ability to be able to talk about humanity, but I don't see him as a one-on-one understanding our problems and relating to us. And so, Stephen, I guess I would tell you that I don't quite buy into your grand strategy, and I think the shortcomings of the president are going to make it very hard for him to be able to do it.
Peter, well, if you don't agree with his grand strategy, what do you think Obama, just in a very practical sense, where does he go now post healthcare? In a more practical, short-term sense.
Well, there's only one place for him to go, and that's the economy. And if he doesn't get to the economy, you can forget about healthcare. There's only one number you need to watch to figure out how this election and going to the over-under is what is the unemployment rate. You tell me what the unemployment rate in October of 2010, I'll tell you what the over-under is. I mean, because it's as simple as that. If he hasn't moved the unemployment rate down, I don't care what other indicators we're seeing, that's going to be the thing that's going to affect the election most. And if there's an error in the first year, I would look at it slightly differently, and that is he spent the whole first year, 15 months, on health care, and he never got back to the economy, and he has to get back to the economy.
Mark, and the Obama people agree with that, right? They want to pivot back to the economy, is their phrase, I think?
They do. I think that the second biggest mistake of the first year was not having a commander-in-chief on the economy as the chief economic spokesman. I think if there's anybody in the room who can name George Bush's 3 Treasury secretaries, raise your hand. Quick. George Bush made this same mistake, and I'm really stunned that this president is repeating it. You cannot have the president be the chief economic spokesperson for a variety of reasons. We're at a time of economic crisis. The joblessness is not just a political thing to talk about. It is a real problem affecting millions of American families. The president has about 6 people who speak for him on the economy. All of them are smart people. None of them are particularly good public figures. None of them have the commanding presence of a commander-in-chief who's going to get up every day, go before the television cameras and say, here's what we're doing today to bring jobs back to America with optimism and determination. And they still have not addressed this problem. It's easy to say we're going to pivot to the economy, but until they find that person, I don't think they'll do it effectively. And I think the biggest thing the president can do to bring down that unemployment number is to talk in an optimistic way about the economy and to explain why the fundamentals of the economy are strong. John McCain was right, even if he was politically disastrous. They don't have that problem solved. They're working on it, but they don't seem disinclined to move at any of the current people, and none of them have the capacity to do it.
Would you fire Geithner?
I would have fired him months ago.
How
Not only because he's bad on TV, but he is too close to people who are not only unpopular, but have been insufficiently held accountable for what's happened.
Mark, how much of it is their conceit, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but I'm sure you heard the same thing, their conceit that Obama's the best spokesman, that he more than Geithner, he's the best guy to put out there.
You cannot have the president who has too many other things to do and who cannot be drawn into discussions of interest rates or particular industries in a way that's effective. He just cannot perform that job. He can talk about the economy plenty, and he should, but there should be somebody every day who has good relations with the private sector, which unfortunately this president does not particularly have, who can go to Wall Street and be a little bit populist, but also talk to them in a way that's respectful, but most importantly, go before the American people every day and talk about it. The president just can't do that. He's overseas. He's got other things he needs to do.
Stephen, would you get rid of Geithner?
Oh, I probably wouldn't have picked him in the first place. I understand why they did. I'm sitting here trying not to disagree with Mark Halperin again, because I like his work, and I sort of agree with a lot of what he just said. But there's two problems here. One is that there really are limits to what Washington can do to fix an economy. I mean, Washington just can't command an economy to get better and turn knobs. That was the old 60s conceit. But I do agree emphatically that he should have been talking about it in a more positive and deliberate way from day one. You know, it reminds me a little bit of the first President Bush. You know, one of the reasons that he lost his job was that we had a recession then, mild compared to this one, but he wasn't talking about it. And the reason he didn't talk about it is his economic team said, you know, we've got this credit crunch because of the S&L crash and a few other things, but it's going to work through, and the best thing to do substantively would be nothing. Well, maybe the best thing to do is to do nothing, but not to say nothing, not in our particular political system.
He went and bought tube socks. Remember he went up to, he bought some tube socks? Remember that was the president's big thing, he was going to buy some socks.
This is the problem with both Bushes, is that you're not quite sure whether it's better for them not just do nothing, but also say nothing, but that's Anyway, so I think there were policy mistakes made. Even from a liberal point of view, I think there's other things they might have done a year ago or even 3 or 4 months ago, and now it's kind of late to get started on it, but certainly should have talked a better game. But boy, they're in a tough spot. And I think, by the way, they may have made the same calculation. We've got to work off this horrendous housing bubble and all the wreckage from it. The stimulus to try and plug some holes and keep things from completely collapsing, that's sensible. And backstop the banking system. It's unpopular, but also necessary, probably, and sensible. But that's a hard case to make. I mean, I have some sympathy for them. I sort of want to defend them a little bit, saying they may have.
What did we disagree about?
Well, I'm not sure. Maybe I backed off. I'll take that marker back off the floor.
We should probably talk about foreign policy a little bit, I suppose. I think that if you think back to 2006, 2007, you might have thought this would be a foreign policy presidency. You would have thought that the post-George Bush presidency would be one oriented around foreign policy, and that, I think, has not happened. So, Mark, let me ask you, since you just wrote a book on Obama, one thing that happened, of course, is the economy went in the tank, and that refocuses policy domestically. But is it also true that Obama's sort of basic personal focus and interest is more domestic than
I don't think so. I think he's extraordinarily interested in the world, and I think it is sometimes a cop-out in evaluating a president and a presidency to say the jury is out. I think the jury is out on almost every issue that the president has on his agenda. There are some areas, like relations with Japan and the Middle East peace process, where he is in a worse place now than he inherited. There are many places where I believe, despite what some conservatives say, that he's moved the country to a better place. The issue is not ripe yet. The achievement is not there, with the exception of this deal with the Russians. But in terms of dealing with Russia overall, China overall, dealing with North Korea, dealing with Iran, I think the president has put down a down payment that he may be able to reap the benefits of going forward. 2 areas going backwards, lots of areas going forward without success yet, and I think, again, the jury is out. It's too soon to say. He has, I will tell you, in terms of personnel, I'm critical of the economic team, as I just was. I think his foreign policy team is first-rate. They're patriots. They're hardworking. They're getting along better than any foreign policy team of our lifetime in terms of being cooperative, of putting the country's interests first, of talking a lot. The National Security Advisor is, by my reporting, a weak link in this team. But the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, their deputies, and the top people in the White House below the National Security Advisor and the Vice President are extraordinarily talented, hardworking, and again, they've laid a lot of foundation. They just need to hope things move a little bit further so there's actual achievements there.
Peter, you're nodding vigorously. You agree?
Well, I think Mark is absolutely right. Public opinion also supports it. On foreign policy, actually has higher marks than his overall job rating. And I think the thing that everybody would have said when he put together this team, especially the State Department, these people are going to be at each other's throats within a week, and they've turned out to be exactly the opposite. I mean, they have been team players, and they come from a group of very self-concerned ego people. And I think it's a tremendous credit to the president. And my guess is that that when he goes to 2012, he will be running with this in mind rather than running away from it. The one question mark in all of this has to be Afghanistan, which we don't know how that'll play out.
And just to say one more thing, which I left, I think is incredibly important. These people making these decisions have done them in a non-ideological way and without any regard to, best I can tell, to political considerations, which is different than the previous two administrations, and again, extraordinarily admirable.
Stephen, what do you think of the president's foreign policy performance
Well,
so far?
I'd say two things. I would agree precisely about the foreign policy team, and I think what I think from sort of watching this and reading about and studying it for several presidencies is the Secretary of Defense always wants to be the Secretary of State. That was explicitly true in Weinberger's case. And the National Security Advisor tries to sort out the fights between the two of them, and it's often ugly, and there's almost no way to fix that. This administration has fixed it better than anybody, and I think it's a testimony of the personality mix. And sometimes it's just that simple. And maybe it was lucky, maybe it was Obama's perception. Either one is to his credit, I think. I do think, now I'm sorry, I am going to stick with my fourth great wave of liberal reform theme for Obama.
Whether you like it or not.
Well, by the way, it's it may be meant as warning to conservatives, but it's praise for liberals. I mean, I don't mean that as an attack or something. But whether you accept it or not, if you think about the last three great waves of liberal reform, what was the undoing of all of them? Well, it was war. World War I for the Progressive Era, World War II, stopped the New Deal. I mean, they wanted to get it cranked up again after the war was over, but they had the election of '46, which stopped that, right? And then the Vietnam War and the Great Society. So regardless of whether you think Obama's, all the different sort of attacks that are made on him from the right, I think you can see that what really worries him is that something falls apart in the Middle East and Pakistan. Israel starts a war with Iran, the Gulf goes up, and that would sort of be the undertow that would test all those people no matter how well they get along now. And I think that's probably what keeps a lot of people awake at night.
Before we go to questions from the audience, let's talk a little bit about, we talked about the over-under on the midterm elections. So let's go strictly to politics here. Elections. Peter, you poll for a living. What is the perspective for the midterm elections?
Why don't we give it to Mark as an over-under, and then we can all either say we go over or under. So you said you play Danny Sheridan, and we'll tell you that's the odds maker, and tell us where you would set the bar.
My answer's not going to be that satisfactory to you. I believe in the view of the political philosopher Yogi Berra, who says prediction is difficult, especially about the future. Right. I think if the election were held today, and I know it's not, Democrats would lose the House and the Senate. Barbara Boxer would lose, and Patty Murray would lose, and the Republicans would control 30 of the 36 biggest governorships. I also believe that almost every trend between now and November is going to favor the Democrats. They're raising money, their recruitment, they're going to get a lot of lucky breaks in primaries where the more conservative and unelectable Republicans are going to win. I think Republicans are not going to take back either the House or the Senate on the current trend, and that the president is going to get credit for that. And it's going to be the worst thing to happen to his presidency because they're going to have narrow Democratic majorities. They're not going to have Republicans working with them. I think the best thing that could happen to him to achieve his objectives is for Republicans to take back the House. But I don't have numbers because it's a moving target. But I don't think if you want me to make up numbers for the sake of your thing, I'd say 5 Senate seats and 22 House seats, which would be extraordinarily good from the perspective of where we are today.
That would be a Democratic victory, I think, if that
I'll
happened.
give you a number. I mean, I think, at a minimum, 20 Republicans pick up 20 seats on a great night for Democrats. They'd be doing cartwheels down Pennsylvania Avenue. And I think the upper limit, I think they could lose more than 50 House seats.
Yeah, Mark Halperin, I can easily see a case where the news is not all good between now and November, and not just for the unemployment figure Peter mentioned. You mentioned the WellPoint insurance rate increases here a couple months ago, and I agree, that was a shocking moment that was very helpful to Obama. But we've already seen a number of major corporations say we've got to restate our earnings going forward to reflect a very large cost to us of this health care bill, and that's upset Henry Waxman. Between now and November, a great many people are going to enter their annual open enrollment period for insurance. I wonder what happens if a lot of states, especially now that are low cost, if there's an early impact of the bill, still not clear to me if there is going to be one, but what if there is one, and people are going to get these large increases, possibly, in their health insurance around October, and a lot of them are going to think, wait a minute, I thought we fixed all this.
And, I'm real skeptical of this whole argument, too, and I did give this huge number, which is a way of saying who the hell knows. I do think, though, I am very skeptical of this democratic notion that, we're going to capitalize. People are going to see that the bill out there is not that bad. I find it very hard to see how you make great political gains. It's like proving a negative. Okay, so if you talk to analysts, economic experts, they'll say, you know what? The stimulus bill was, kept things from being a whole lot worse. And you don't see the president and the Democrats getting a whole lot of credit for that. So I don't see Democrats getting a whole lot of credit when people realize that the health care bill isn't as awful as maybe they thought it might be. I don't see that.
I'll give you my over-underline if I...
Okay, well, I want Peter to, you wanted the hard numbers. Give us the hard numbers, Peter.
I'll go with, I'll play off of Mark. I'd take the over. In other words, I think it's going to be worse than 22 seats. I think it'll be, I'd say 28, 29 is where I would start to say, I'm not sure if I go over under. In the Senate, I think it'll be worse than 5 seats. So the Democrats will get down towards the 52, 53 range, something like that. So I see it as a tough Democratic year. The one thing that I think saves the Democrats is something Neil Newhouse, the Republican pollster, talked about last week, and that is the Republicans are underfunded. And being underfunded, that will make a difference. The one thing that will change that is how much does the Chamber of Commerce put in and how much do they cover and change the election.
So you see the Democrats hanging on to the House?
What?
Democrats hold on to the House.
Democrats are hanging on.
Numbers, I think you call it in the polling business within the margin of error. Yours aren't so different than mine. Underfunded, bad recruitment in key places, the primaries I mentioned, no national leaders, no issues, and I think, again, people criticize the president and Democrats for looking backwards and blaming President Bush for everything, but I think in some of these races, they're going to really be tough on Republicans and say they're not for anything except going back to Bush-Cheney policies.
But you say no issues, no leaders, and I think I'm more pessimistic on Democratic chances than either of you two. I mean, it's a referendum on Obama. I mean, simply saying no.
It is today, but it may not be. This guy, we saw it in healthcare, we saw it in his presidential campaign. He's great at the end. He is a fourth quarter player by his own description. And I think from Labor Day on, he is going to be creating a national environment, not everywhere, he can't go everywhere, but in the places he can go, he's going to create a good environment for Democratic candidates.
Well, I hope you're right. And the one thing that I would say is the difference from 94 is that in 1994, the Republicans were held in at least positive esteem by the American public. This year they go in.
Many more were Democratic retirements in 94 than we've seen.
Absolutely
and it's much easier
true.
to beat an
People
open
talk about the
seat.
assault weapons thing was a huge thing at the end.
Yeah.
People talk about health care. That was a big deal. Passing that assault weapons ban, that was a really big deal.
Yeah, the election I compare this to, it would be 82, which is Reagan's first midterm election. Unemployment on election day in November, I think, was 11%.
10.0.
10.0. I thought it was higher than that. Well, okay. But Republicans lost 28 seats in the House, and by all the sort of conventional political science models, they should have lost more. They stayed even in the Senate or even went up one, I think. Now, partly that was the quirk of the Senate cycle, which is always idiosyncratic. But remember, people are old geezers like us. Reagan made the argument, his argument that whole campaign was stay the course. It was an argument to virtue and sacrifice and seriousness. I think Obama can make the same argument, as long as he can sort out what the argument is behind it. But I think he can make the same argument. And so, my over-under is, by the way, Democrats have probably, I'm going to make up a number, 20 seats they probably ought not to have where they outperformed the last couple of election cycles. Republicans are due to get back a bunch of those anyway in a good year. So that would mean that their real net pickup, if they only got 28 or 30 is really only about 10 of the solid Democrat seats they're taking away. And so I don't know. I think it's got to be way north of 30 before the interpretation would be this is a stunning rebuke of Obama. I think if it's only 25 to 30, Obama is happy with that.
See, the thing, Peter, I look at your numbers, your intensity numbers, and maybe that's going to change between now and then, but I mean, it's just off the charts. I mean, it's just...
The White House legislative strategy for the rest of the year is wholly predicated on turning up the intensity. It's going after Wall Street, it's going after big money in politics, and doing an energy bill that will rev people up, and he'll do other things that they haven't announced yet. So they're all just going for revving up the energy. That's what they're doing, and it's not about cooperating with Republicans.
And if we don't see a change in intensity numbers, then essentially the health care may be a major legislative achievement, but it won't be a political achievement.
Okay, let's go to questions from the audience. And first of all, I congratulate you all because the questions are much better than we've had in past years. So congratulations. I hope you're not the same people who came in past years. But anyway.
It must be my class.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. And actually, one takes off of your comment a moment ago, Mark, on an energy bill. There are several cards related to two big issues, and will we see those in Obama's first term: immigration reform and climate energy legislation. So I'll start with you. I mean, does having done health care, does Obama move on either this year or during the first term to try to do immigration and or climate?
Right.
Both big pieces of domestic policy.
I think it's unknowable until we see the results of the election. If the president is wiped out in the midterms and loses control of one or both houses and chambers, and again, I'm not saying that can't happen, it's just not my view of the current trajectory. I think he may try to do both those issues in a lame duck session because you'll have a lot of Democrats who want to work on those issues, but if they've already lost their jobs, their votes would be easier to be had. If he keeps a narrow control, I think it's very hard to do immigration in the next year. But I think he will try to do energy and the environment. The key is, can they get some Republicans? I don't think this is one where he can get on final passage in the House or the Senate Democrats to walk the plank and do it alone. I think he's going to have to get some Republicans, and right now I don't know what the path to that is.
Stephen, do you think he can get Republican support?
Well, you know, I thought the climate bill in any form was dead until healthcare passed, and then Reagan used to, whenever he'd won something big, he'd press really hard. That's when he started making mistakes. Not saying the parallel is exact, but I would now not be surprised to see them push very hard on an energy bill, climate bill. There are a few Republicans interested in trying to work out a deal on this. Lindsey Graham most prominently, but there are some others.
And he's already got a House bill.
Well, the Waxman, I don't think the Waxman-Markey bill is going anywhere, but I think some Senate, it might be like healthcare. The Senate might try for something. Lisa Murkowski's been making very interesting noises about all of this. I've written a ton about this. There's lots of moving parts, and I can get very wonky, and I don't want to wreck the evening for everybody. I'm not sure it's a real political winner, though, Mark. I mean, I think that there's a reason why so many coal state Democrats are leery of it, like Jay Rockefeller.
It's another area where he wants to do the right thing, and he's willing to pay a political price.
Yeah.
It's not clear that House Democrats on either immigration or energy are willing to pay a political price.
Right, and that was a real tough one.
Peter, what about immigration? Isn't there some upside for Democrats taking up immigration? In the sense of, energizing the base in some of those states, particularly for 2012, and also driving a wedge, making Republicans vote on this and create some problems for them.
It's true, especially with the Hispanic vote, but on the other side of it, it also creates all kinds of friction within the Democratic coalition. I mean, immigration has always been close to having a third rail to it, because essentially it is so close to everybody's lifestyle and values and everything else. So it is a very, very tough issue. And I don't know how you put it together. I think, losing Senator Kennedy is one example where his ability to craft legislation and to get bipartisan support so much harder now. That's the way I look at it.
Here's a question on something very newsy, very topic of the day. Which direction do you see Obama going in selecting a Supreme Court nominee? Mark, we talked about this at lunch a little bit, but what do you think he might do?
I think it's very unlikely he'll choose a white male. I think he's going to get only.
Peter.
Yeah. I think he'll choose someone of outstanding quality. I think he'll do the same thing he did with Joe Biden, which is to pick someone who the public instantly sees as qualified, because it's the right thing to do and it's the best way to sell somebody. And if I had to guess, I think it'll be a female sitting judge, and there's a number of those apparently under consideration.
And he will reject the calls, therefore, for a non-judicial appointee.
I think so.
Okay.
But remember, I'm the guy who said Hillary Clinton would never be offered a job in the administration.
Here's another question. What role do you think racism has played in the extreme bipartisanship we have seen, in the extreme partisanship, I think the question means, we have seen in Washington since Obama's election? Let me rephrase this just a little bit and say, to what degree has race played a role in the public reaction to Obama as candidate and as president? Stephen?
All right, I'll give it a try.
You would have thought this is the first African-American
Yeah.
president. This would be a landmark moment. Has race not been as important as we might all have thought it would be?
Well, this is the open wound of America's soul going back to the founding, right? And it's going to be for a very long time. And I mean, for the most part, I actually admired his speech he made about the Reverend Wright business during the campaign. I actually wrote an article comparing it favorably to Lincoln's temperance address, one of his obscure speeches that most people don't know about for interesting reasons. And for the most part, I think he's played it very well, Obama himself, and what's obviously he's in a delicate spot. I think he did fumble the Gates business at Harvard. He may admit that himself, I think, that. I think that the opposition to him, most people I know, most conservatives I know who didn't vote for him were pleased that he was elected for that reason. That, I gave a speech right after the election saying, we finally have an answer to Frederick Douglass's great question, what country have I? That famous 4th of July speech of his where a person who defended the Declaration of Independence and the American founding, but then was challenging his wide audience to live up to it in the same way Martin Luther King did a century later, right? So, I thought that was I woke up the day after the election, wary of Obama's ideology, but thrilled that it happened in an overwhelming way, by the way. I mean, one of the things I was dreading was let's not have another close election that's contested with people wondering if it was legitimate and all the rest of that. It was a good thing he won by a lot, is what I think. And so I don't know, it's hard to tell with the whole spectrum. Look, there's the sort of nuttiness is sort of evenly distributed across the American political spectrum. But I don't think it's
I think it's much more on the right.
Well, I'm more fair-minded than you, Peter.
What do the numbers say about the issue, the importance of race?
Well, look, race has always been exceptionally important and exceptionally central in terms of all of politics. I would tell you, based on everything that I've done, I have been amazed at sort of the low level that race has played in the judgment of the Obama presidency. And you can say a lot of things about the way in which the Republicans have dealt with the president and dealt with presidential politics, but I'd have to give them great credit in terms of the issue of race. I think by and large they've handled themselves in an admirable way, by and large. And what I would tell you is that the Republicans did take a great deal of pride, and I did enough focus groups after the election to hear how they reacted. They may not have been happy politically, but certainly in terms of bringing the country together, I think it's very important. As I was saying to Mark, a plug for him, and that is his writing on the Reverend Wright speech given by Barack Obama is brilliant, it's insightful, and you ought to talk about that as it both relates to this president and his bearings, and number two, sort of how you think race has played off of this.
Well, I think everything you said is about the dominant behavior of prominent Republicans and about the attitude that most Americans have in pride. It was true up until recently. I think anecdotally that there is in the Tea Party movement, not everyone involved in the Tea Party movement, but in segments of the Tea Party movement, on talk radio, in other aspects of what I call the right-wing freak show, there is an increasing focus sometimes explicit and oftentimes, I think, either unconscious or cleverly done on the president's race in a way that I think is the first time since he became a national figure where that is a threat to him politically and a threat to civil discourse. There is, I think, the possibility that will become increasingly common and really unfortunate. And the president is extraordinarily good at dealing with it personally and politically, and I think he will do everything he can to tamp it down. But I'm troubled by what I've seen in the last 3 months. Again, talk radio and in some quarters. At the Tea Party rally, the first one they did in Searchlight, Harry Reid's hometown, right behind the stage was a person holding up two things. In one hand, a sign that said, "Send Obama," O-B-U-M-A, O-B-U-M-A, "Send Obama back to Kenya." And in their right hand, they held a puppet of a monkey. And that was right behind the stage at this event. Not a single speaker, including Governor Palin and others, said anything about it. And again, it's anecdotal, but I've seen increasingly I've seen things like that, and it's the first time it's been a factor. I think race helped him beat Hillary Clinton and helped him beat John McCain, but I think now it's a real problem, and it's going to be hard to address. And I think until Republican leaders repudiate these things, I can't be totally praising of how they personally handled it in their own going after the president.
And speaking of the Tea Party, one of the questions is about the future of the Tea Party. Will the Tea Party become a coherent force, or will it break down into incoherent groups? Somebody want to talk about the future? Stephen, you write about the conservative movement.
Yeah.
What's the future of the Tea Party?
I have no idea. I don't think they do either. I think it's destined to be inchoate because it is I think you have some loony nuts in it. You have I think you have a whole spectrum of people who are expressing a populist outrage for various different reasons. It's impossible to lead it. I think there are, this is true, there's some Washington groups that see a parade going down the street and are trying to get in front of it, and they're supplying buses and stuff like that. It reminds me a little bit of the tax revolt of the 70s, but that took very specific form. Well, it was called the tax revolt, right? It took specific form first in the ballot initiatives like Proposition 13 here, and then later became the energy behind the idea of supply-side economics, which then Reagan picks up. There isn't really a Tea Party program yet. There is some vague talk that I kind of like myself about reviving constitutionalism, or the idea of limited government in the older understanding of the Constitution. But it tends to be pretty lightweight. I saw this YouTube video last week I thought was terrific. It was a guy at a Tea Party town hall for a Republican congressman, asking this Republican congressman, can you explain this section of the Constitution or that section? And the congressman made a complete fool of himself because clearly he couldn't. And I would think congressmen ought to be at least a little familiar with some of their own Article 1 about their branch. Well, then it turns out, you Google this guy, he turns out to be some 9/11 truth or nutcase, thinks the Bush and the Saudis are in on the 9/11 attack. And so I don't know what to make of this kind of thing. I mean, that's not, there's no future in that.
No, but if you look at the history of political movements, what tends to happen is large parts of them become co-opted by mainstream, quote, quote, politicians, and then it leaves sort of the people on the far edge, the birthers, the 9/11ers.
Right.
And then they just kind of go away as a political force.
Well, the other thing it reminds me of more recently is Perot in '92. Now, Perot came first, and then the Reform Party came after him. He gets 20% of the vote.
And Perot, what did Perot do? Perot made, balancing the budget, the deficit, a huge issue, and Clinton started talking about it, and then so what happened? You sort of had this little fragmentary people spin off into the militia movement, and then Timothy McVeigh, and then that's the end of that.
Not quite sure I follow all that history, but I was with you until the end there, Mark. But your central point is right. The populist movements tend to get assimilated by one party or the other. But this one is hard to figure out.
The extremes that then discredit the rest of the movement.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, but it's going to be Tea Partiers, I think, who may cost Bennett his job in Utah, you mentioned earlier.
Right, and who knows, maybe the constitutional part of it. And like I said, and then you have, I did a story on this Deb Medina down in Texas who was fine and dandy and talking about all this great stuff, and then she goes spinning off on the 9/11 craziness, and that was the end of her campaign.
Yeah.
Mark, let me ask you this one. This is a sort of related to, you've written a lot about Obama, to his character. What is Obama's single greatest flaw, and what does he need to do to change it?
Single greatest flaw. Well, Give me just a moment. It's not a question I want to answer unthoughtfully. I mean, I think the thing I think he should change is finding an economic spokesperson that I already mentioned. But I think this is a question more about about his character.
Yes.
I think, and you saw this in the campaign. I think that he's never been tested since he got on the national stage in a fundamental way about does he need to rethink his assumptions. When he was 30 points down to Hillary Clinton, when Sarah Palin's selection was discombobulating the Democratic Party and the campaign, he was urged to change course in a fundamental way. In both cases, he chose not to. He chose to stay the course and to ignore the critics who were urging him to make a fundamental change. I fear that he may have overlearned that lesson. He's not been tested yet. Healthcare may have reinforced that notion of staying the course rather than rethinking. Again, he went from Jimmy Carter to Rambo Roosevelt in 2 weeks, but he still hasn't solved that fundamental problem. He still hasn't had that test, and I think all presidents, Reagan did it, Clinton did it, Bush did not do it, and I think his presidency suffered for it. When things are off course, when your assumptions are wrong, you need to rethink them and change direction. And I think, he hasn't done it. Is it a flaw? Because it's worked out for him, not maybe technically, but I worry about that more than anything else, that he never makes a fundamental change in personnel or in his assumptions about his legislative agenda or about what his presidency can and should achieve, and goes down a dead end and can't turn around in time.
Peter, you've seen a lot of presidents, dealt with lots of presidents in Washington. What would you say is his greatest flaw that you've seen?
Well, I think I'm going to go back to where the voters come from, and that is I don't think that he is a inside politician. And the ability to be able to achieve the ends that he's going to need to achieve, I'm not sure that from that point of view. I think that he has a real sense of self, and maybe not enough self-doubt, but certainly a sense of self. And I think at the stage where he is tested, I think he'll come out in great shape, because I think both intellectually and in terms of sort of a sense of his core and what he's about, I think he's going to be very strong at that moment. That's my optimistic part. But I think the hard part is that essentially he doesn't really love politics. And politics is something that you have to enjoy, and it becomes so fundamental in terms of making things happen. And I think that's going to be his weakness throughout. I mean, I think he chose Rahm Emanuel because he saw in Rahm everything that he wasn't. And so consequently, he looked for that, and I'm not sure that he has it, and maybe he'll develop it, but I have a question mark.
Let's do one final question, which is actually sort of looking backwards at the election. Did Obama misread the election result? Were people voting for fundamental change or just trying to punish the Republicans? What was the meaning of the election that brought Obama to power?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, what voters don't, that's why we're split. I think that a lot of the independents in the middle, who are the decisive major bloc that swing American elections one way or the other, I think that a lot of them were voting because they were really tired of Bush and Republicans. And I think change is one of the oldest tropes in politics, and so is hope. Change to what? Hope for Obama was a little vague on that. Very skillfully done. I mean, I think it's exactly the way to do it. I think that they didn't necessarily anticipate the change with a capital C that I've been sort of laying out earlier, although I mean, it might back off a little bit from my audacious claim for his audacity earlier and say this. I think in a certain sense, some of Obama's troubles may be the odd circumstances. Here's what I think was part of the mistake with the stimulus and the health care bill. It was the TARP bailout. Because I think what happened is Paulson came in and wanted to pick a number that would be the financial equivalent of shock and awe. And it was shocking, $700 billion to bail out the banks, and what do these people do? And then you come along with a stimulus a few months later. I think a lot of the Democrats in the House thought, wow, they've just opened the door to us. We can do something huge here. And I think a lot of that old Perot type sentiment from 92 was shocked at the amount of spending going on. And then the health care bill on top of all that with this very large price tag, and whether it's paid for and all the CBO numbers work or not, I think was a problem. So that's sort of the way I think this has unfolded in ways that account for a good chunk of independent opinion that is worried about debt and what the future is going to be like. I will say, this interesting contrast, and I'll say this in praise of Obama. One of the things, again, that struck me in comparing the Reagan years and Obama's rise is, if you remember back to the stock market crash of '87, Greenspan's brand new as Fed's head of the Fed, and they did not panic about the crash of '87. When, by the way, I tell the story at great length in my books, I'll do a little quick plug. The market nearly shut down the next day. It was even worse the day after the 500-point collapse. And if it had shut down, it wouldn't have opened again for weeks, and you might have then really had a crash. So what happened in September of 2008? In my mind, they panicked. And maybe you needed to do something like TARP. It wasn't clear to me. I mean, we ended up spending the money on GM, which is partly a bank, I guess. But and it seemed to me they made things immeasurably worse by that reaction. And since you asked the election campaign, McCain, I was telling somebody at dinner that I like to do anagrams. So I took my McCain-Palin lawn sign and rearranged it. It rearranges to calm in panic. It's McCain Palin. Comes calm and panic. That was on front of because I manifestly was wrong about McCain, right? He completely freaked out and suspended his campaign and did all these goofy things. If you're curious, by the way, Biden rearranges to bomb an idea. This is the way I've spent my spare time. But Obama reacted very coolly. So back to the previous question, by the way, he's a very cool customer. That's a good thing in many ways. Very interesting comment, Peter, you made about him maybe not liking politics. The analytical aspect of him, that appealed to people because that was the opposite of Bush. We often vote for candidates for the opposite of the thing that in front of us now that we really have come to dislike. Bush was not that way at all. And so I agree with what you said. I'm sort of circling back to their question, is I think the interesting test for Obama is when a moment comes along when he needs to emote with the American people. The way Bill Clinton did after the Oklahoma City bombing, the way Reagan did numerous times. And I think that's going to be an important political test for him. That was rambling a bit, sorry, but
That's fine.
it was fun stuff.
The meaning of the election, Peter, do you want to?
I would say two things. It was change, we can believe it. That essentially set up the covenant of this election and sets up the covenant of what people elected him for. But I would tell you that 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, and 2010 are all one election. It is a message to Washington: we hate you, we hate what you're doing, and we are trying to do everything to send you a message that we want our voices in, and we will do anything to change things. And so they grasped onto a Tea Party, not subscribing to a philosophy, but as a way of trying to send a message to Washington. And what it comes down to is, at the end of the first year, when voters looked at Barack Obama, personally, his scores were up on the 60% level when you looked at all of the qualities. On the professional level, they were down at 43% on average, and the things that were hurting most were the sense that he could change Washington and two, getting things done. I think that's changed with the healthcare, but overall, I see all of these elections are sending one message to Washington, and it hasn't changed. And until Obama either shows that he can change the culture or shows that he can operate within this culture to achieve that change, I think that he's on the weak side of the equation.
And we will come back next year and talk about 2010 and see if you're right about the 2010 election. A quick reminder, Mark's book, Game Change, is for sale outside. He will sign them. Sadly, not Stephen's book, sorry. My thanks to the panel, Peter Hart, Mark Halperin, Stephen Hayward, Mark Bareback. Thank you and good night.
That was good.